Hello, as we are coming to the holiday season, or in the holiday season, probably by the time this goes up. A couple of these videos have been part of my gift to my family, right? I already recorded one that was my older brother, a gift from my older brother. Now I'm recording one for my mom. My mom is being awesome and going back to school to get her master's in marriage and family therapy. So my gift for her is the 7 principles for making marriage work. Not because she has a marriage that doesn't work. That is not why I'm getting her this book, but because this book is a fantastic book for marriage and family therapists. So, I have been reading this book and highlighting parts of the book that stick out to me, and this video is for me to talk through some of them so that my mom and I can have an asynchronous intellectual conversation about something that she's studying. So, with that being said, let's get into the first part of the book. Chapter 1 of the book, Inside the Seattle Love Lab, The Truth About Happy Marriages. There are a few items in this book that stuck out to me, or in this chapter that stuck out to me. So on page 4, Mr. Gottman has a section on emotionally intelligent marriages. And the first sentence there, I will read, says, "What can make a marriage work is surprisingly simple." And I'll stop there. A theme throughout this book, and I think a theme throughout my life, or just life in general, is that what makes a marriage work, what makes a life work, what makes a body work, is surprisingly simple. A lot of things are surprisingly simple. Frequently, we conflate that those things are easy, right? And he talks about this later. I don't know if it's in this chapter, but that these things are simple, and they are. A lot of things that make our life better are simple. But just being simple to understand is not easy to implement. So that was my first takeaway. That for anybody who wants to make their marriage work, wants to make their body work, their career work, a lot of the advice is simple to understand. It's like, well, duh, got to work out, you got to eat right. But that doesn't mean it's easy to do. So keep that in mind as you go throughout the rest of this book. Just because it's easy to understand does not mean it's easy to do. The second section I wanted to cover in the same page, I think it's the next sentence or two. He says, "In their day-to-day lives, they," meaning happy marriages, "have hit upon a dynamic that keeps their negative thoughts and feelings about each other, which all couples have, from overwhelming their positive ones." Now, I boxed around which all couples have. I think there is an expectation in a lot of marriages that you will never think poorly about the other person, and if you do, you are structurally messed up. At least I felt that I encountered that idea while I was in college, while I was in high school, etc. If you had issues, then that having the issue was an issue. Whereas I think having issues is just a natural part of any relationship. And the sooner you realize that, the sooner you can get past it. All right, so I had a couple of other highlights, but the next one I wanted to talk about, it's kind of petty, but he in here, if you can see it, couples who attend my workshop have a relapse rate that's about half that from standard marital therapy. And the main takeaway I had from this was like, come on, man, we're already reading your book. You have to advertise. So yeah, that's fine though. I mean, it is his book, so he can do what he wants. I don't have a book, so if I did, I might advertise in it. All right, the next part of chapter 1 that I wanted to discuss is on page 14, and he says, "One of the most startling findings of our research is that couples who have maintained happy marriages rarely do anything that even partly resembles active listening when they're upset." I thought this was funny. This comes at the end of a section all about active listening, and it's like, therapists normally just say, "Communicate better, active listening." He's like, "Yeah, that doesn't work. At least not the way you think it will." And the main lesson here that I got was that your disposition is more important than your tactics. And this is a theme throughout the book as well. You can have the most adept language skill of anybody in the world. But if you don't have the heart behind it, if you aren't meaning what you're saying, if you aren't trying to understand, then it doesn't matter what tools you use. It doesn't matter what frameworks you use. All that matters is that you're not trying to understand. And that is easy to tell, right? I am frustratingly good at deception. And I have only found that out because I've deceived people, and I don't want to. But even when I try, uh, or I guess when I tried, it's been a while. I think because of my tendency to um, be a little bit better at deceiving, I see that as an existential threat to my quality of life and something that I should never implement. So because of that, I try to be exceptionally honest now, even when it's not super convenient. Where was I going with that? Oh, right. You can use the tools to deceive people, but it doesn't really work. We can always tell that something's off. Uh, there's always a little bit of um, that intuition that we have. And so the tactics by themselves will not bring you to a happy marriage. Tactics by themselves will get you to a fantastic contract, a legal agreement, but not a happy marriage. So I hope that you had some good thoughts about chapter 1, about what makes a happy marriage. Let me know what you thought. I look forward to having our asynchronous intellectual discussion. And let's go on to chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 is called What Does Make Marriage Work? And the answer is not just communication. It's a lot of chocolate, actually. Just kidding. The first principle that I wanted to cover in this one that stuck out to me was in this first section, actually. Friendship versus fighting. If you can see, happy marriages are based on a deep friendship. I've seen that a lot. My wife and I are such good friends. And the better our friendship, the better our relationship. Whenever I get frustrated with something that could be considered a marital problem, I'm just it always comes back to that I just enjoy our friendship, right? In fact, a lot of times our marital problems for me become kind of a sense of like loneliness because it kind of feels like, oh, I'm trying to do this all by myself or whatnot, and it makes me incredibly sad because and first off, it's not true that I'm doing it alone, but it feels like it is, right? So within that context of my feelings, um, if I consider myself alone, that means that my wife isn't with me, and that is so sad. Uh, so I concur. Happy marriages are based on a deep friendship, and I think the first step to repairing a marriage is to repair the friendship. It really is. I love laughing with my wife. We're awesome. Okay, the next one that I had in mind was, oh, this was interesting. So, what does make he has a section of this on what does make marriage work, right? And he talks through why do people break up? And this paragraph here on page 26, let me see. He says betrayal is fundamentally any act or life choice that doesn't prioritize the commitment and put the partner before all others. And most of us are guilty of faithlessness from time to time. But betrayal lies at the heart of every failed relationship. And this made me think that, I mean, I haven't cheated on my wife, at least not, in a sexual way. I don't think I've cheated emotionally. I don't even know what that would mean. But the concept that betrayal is fundamentally any act or life choice that doesn't prioritize the commitment and put the partner before all others. There's a lot of times that I don't do that. You could consider what I'm doing now as not doing that because I'm putting our relationship, mother, before my wife, although she is gone tonight. But either way, I like to work a lot, and that's putting something before our commitment. I work out. You know, it's, let's see. Of course, it's not the case that taking care of myself um, is a betrayal until it is, right? Anything taken too far, of course, is putting something else before my wife and our commitment. So while pondering this, I don't think it's useful to take it too far and feel bad about everything that is not explicitly about the commitment. However, I think it is a good exercise just to do a quick inventory and say where am I possibly lacking in the commitment prioritization, and what ways can I improve, right? So maybe not a game changing aspect, but I do love self reflection, so I would recommend. The next idea that I had a thought about was on the next page, actually, page 27. Let's see if you can read it. It's that last paragraph on page 27. There's a lot to read, so I'm just going to summarize it. He states that the success or failure of a couple's repair attempts is one of the primary factors in whether their marriage is likely to flourish or flounder. And then what determines the success of their repair attempts is the strength of their marital friendship. If this sounds simplistic or obvious, you'll find it in the pages ahead that it is not. So going back to the idea that easy to understand is not easy to implement. I found this idea of repair attempts fascinating, though. I think a little bit later in the book, he says that the worst marriages had the most number of repair attempts, but they just were ignored. What I like about this is that it doesn't treat our marriage like a ceramic pot or a fragile glass something, but rather, oh yeah, it's the whole difference between fragile and anti-fragile, where it's ceramic pots, glass things are fragile. You know, you break them and they break and they can't really be repaired. And that's what is a fragile thing. But people and I think some materials are anti-fragile. Like swords. I like swords. So when you pound a sword, it makes it stronger, right? That's what the pounding is supposed to do. So with anti-fragile things, the pressure makes them stronger. In marriages, pressure makes them stronger because of the repair attempts. It's not quite the same with steel, right? Because you can't it's not organic, so it can't repair itself. But in marriages, the reason that good marriages are anti-fragile is because of these repair attempts, where when they have pressure, when they could break, when they could crack, the members of the marriage repair that stronger to what it was before. So I like that idea of repair attempts, and that it is simple, but it's not easy. All right, the last one was on the next page. This was interesting. So he states that most marital arguments cannot be resolved. I think I heard, maybe on a podcast, it doesn't say right here, but it's like 69% of most marital arguments are not resolved. And I've seen that, you know? Um, yeah. I've had a number of arguments that we talk about it. We're like, oh, you know what? We should do this instead, and then we don't. But we feel better anyways because we talked about it and we came to a conclusion together, even though we didn't implement the conclusion. So that was like a little bit of it made me feel good that it's like, okay, it's not just my marital arguments that aren't actually resolved. So, but yeah, that was chapter 2. What does make marriage work? So let me know what you think, and let's go on to chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 is all about how I predict divorce, or I being Mr. John M. Gottman, PhD, predict divorce. The first thing that stood out to me here was actually on page 31, which was the second page of the chapter. It says, the clues to these people's eventual breakup is in the way they argue. And to me, this is another support for the idea that the disposition is more important than the tools, right? So you can argue a whole lot and be fine, because it's how you approach the argument that matters a whole lot more than the words you say. Granted, don't get me wrong, how you approach a situation will usually influence what you say in that situation. Um, but it helps me to remember that I don't need to get the words right if my heart is right. Puts a lot less stress on somebody who worries a lot about words. So the next part of this chapter, he goes through he calls them the four horsemen of divorce, where these four what are they? Particular types of negative interactions. So these four particular types of negative interactions frequently lead to divorce, or just unhappy marriages, particularly when they are when they come together. So the first one is criticism. Criticism, right there. He mentions that there's a difference between complaint and criticism, where a complaint focuses on the specific behavior or event, and criticism is like, you suck because you didn't do you didn't sweep the floor last night. Whereas a complaint is, it sucks that the floor wasn't swept last night. Oh no, a complaint is, I think a complaint might even be, well, no, a complaint is like, I didn't like how you didn't sweep the floor last night. The criticism is like, you suck. You never keep things clean, right? Criticism is about character. Complaint is about not character, but an action. One thing that I found interesting, or that while I was thinking about this, is that for me, when I repress my complaints, they turn into criticisms. So, for example, let's say Grace didn't sweep the floor last night, and we had agreed that she would. Which is a bad example because we never agreed that she should sweep the floor. So it's usually just like, well, whoever gets to it gets to it. Anyways, let's say that we did agree, and she didn't sweep the floor. Then that time, let's say it happens once. I'm like, okay, it's fine, it's fine. I'll just move on and not worry about it. Then it happens again. I'm like, it's fine, it's fine. It happened last weekend, this week, but that's fine. I'm sure it's fine. It happens another week, and by like the third or fourth time, I'm like, come on, you suck. And so when I repress the complaints, when I don't bring them up, they eventually become criticisms because we haven't fixed the behavior. I haven't let it out, so to speak. And so the continued complaints in my mind that are never expressed become a pattern of behavior that I see that turns into a criticism. So that was interesting for me, realizing that what I thought was helpful in trying to look past something that bothered me was actually turning into a criticism about Grace and about my wife. So number 2 is contempt, and that's where the criticism leads to, right? The back to the sweeping example. The complaint is, you didn't sweep that one time, or that time, or that time, or that time. It becomes criticism because you never sweep. Why do we even need food if it's just going to end up on the floor? And then it's criticism easily turns to contempt. With that example, it's like, you never sweep. How could you be such a dirty person? How could you be so messy? How could you live in such a trashy place, right? And it turns into this contempt. And that switch is a huge switch. That is the disposition. The contempt is the disposition. You are approaching the discussion, the argument, with contempt for the person, and that never goes well. One of the examples he walked through, and something he said that was interesting. In this example, the husband's purpose was to demean his wife, really, and he wasn't really looking for resolution. He says his contempt comes in the guise of assuming the high moral ground. I have felt that a lot, where, to be honest, my need to defend my high moral ground turns into contempt for other people. And the source of that really is insecurity. Which is fascinating. Because there have been times where I have been frustrated with Grace for an extended period of time. It's turned into criticism. And when I attack her character, there's always a voice in the back of my head saying, "Yeah, but you chose her." And so, wow, we're going to. I promise, we're fine. I'm just remembering sometimes where I have felt criticism and contempt for Grace, and it has been a very difficult emotional situation for me to be in because it does come from insecurity. It's like if my wife is as bad as I'm making her out to be here, I married her, so that must be my level too. And then I try to avoid that because that's uncomfortable, and so this contempt is an attempt to defend my high moral ground, to avoid that cognitive dissonance. So I try to avoid that, and I try to be good friends with my wife because it's not a fun place to be. So, Horseman 3, let's move on. Defensiveness. This is kind of along the same lines, where you're defending your high moral ground. And he said a couple things. Defensiveness really is a way of blaming your partner. Essentially, when you're being defensive, you're saying the problem isn't me, it's you. Yeah, it's basically just putting walls up around your high moral ground so that you never have to worry about people breaching the walls. Horseman number 4 is stonewalling. And he says that guys do this a whole lot more than girls, which is true. I have done this. Instead of confronting the issue, instead of participating in the argument, I have just disengaged. When my wife is angry, I'm like, okay, well, let's just do what she wants, and we'll get through this, and we can talk about it later. Which isn't great, but actually, yeah, my wife has got mad at me a few times when she's like, "I'm mad and you're not doing anything." I'm like, "Well, there's nothing for me to do. You're mad," which isn't true. But yeah, so I've seen that. I've done that. Try not to. All right. The last one I had was number 52. Oh yes. Just a sec. Sorry about that. I don't know what is going on with my nose. I apologize. The last page of the chapter, after the 4 horsemen and some other stuff, he says, whatever the current state of your marriage, it will benefit enormously if you support, reinvigorate, or, if necessary, resuscitate your friendship. So after talking through the 4 horsemen, some other indicators that lead to divorce or just unhappy marriages, he ends the chapter on a happy note with, you can resuscitate your marriage. And I think that's true. You know, I mentioned I've felt each of the 4 horsemen before. And we have a great marriage. So it's not it. Our marriage is anti-fragile. We can pressure it, and it won't break. But as long as we keep repairing it. So that's chapter 3. Let's move on to chapter 4. Now the book is called 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. However, Principle 1 starts in chapter 4. And that's what we'll be talking about. Enhance your love maps. Now, if you don't know what a love map is, don't worry. He tells you. Essentially, it is each other's own personal world, essentially. In fact, this quote on 54, he says, emotionally intelligent couples are intimately familiar with each other's world. I call this having a richly detailed love map, my term for that part of your brain, where you store all the relevant information about your partner's life. One of the aspects I like about this is that he identifies here that each of us have our own little world, even though we are really close to our partners, right? Really close to our spouses. We still live in our own world. And this is honestly, to me, this is fascinating psychologically, just because each of us really are living in our own world. Um, but the more that we're familiar with our partner's world, the easier it is to understand them and to work within their world as well. Also, I think just understanding that we all live in our own world um, takes a bit of the arrogance and the arrogance of us living in our world. Because okay, when one person lives in their world without understanding that each person has their own world, that shows up in an arrogance where their world is the only world and what they say goes or what they believe to be true is what is true, and that collides when another person is the same way. So, anyways, this whole concept of being familiar with each other's world, I think is awesome. I frequently ask my wife, "Hey, well, especially with social media, right? We have different algorithms and whatnot. I ask my wife, "Hey, have you seen this come up on your social media algorithm?" And it helps me kind of keep track as to what is grounded in reality and what might just be, well, not reality. The rest of this, a lot of this chapter, he has these questionnaires and these activities that I did not do because I was on a time crunch. However, there was one that I started. It was not open-ended questions. It was I'm getting to it. He has one of the exercises in here is getting to know your partner's inner world, right? And so this exercise 3, who am I? I started like writing my own answers with the intent, of course, of talking with my wife about it, and that never happened because we got busy. However, question 1 on page 63: what has happened in your life that you are particularly proud of? Um, One thing that I'm particularly proud of, which is kind of weird, is I got that A in Econ 110. And I know that's not super impressive, but everybody told me I couldn't do it. Or everybody said that nobody could do it. And there were a number of people who encouraged me to get a different professor, and I didn't. And I got an A, and I'm very proud of that. Anyways, the last quote towards the end of the chapter. Most of this chapter is these exercises, but the last quote, the last part is the next step. Love maps are only a first step, and I agree with that. Understanding their world is the beginning, right? If you understand and don't respect it, that's still a problem. But understanding is the first step to respect and the first step for all the rest of these principles. So that is chapter 4 and principle 1. Chapter 5 is principle 2: nurture your fondness and admiration. The first quote that I wanted to talk about here is on page 69, where it says, "Fondness and admiration are two of the most crucial elements in a rewarding and long-lasting romance." I don't have a whole lot to add here other than I agree. I've seen this in my life. When I am not fond of Grace and do not admire Grace, I am not happy, which is really weird because you'd think that, like, oh, and she's not happy either. But it's one of the weird parts about this chapter in particular is if I am not fond of my partner, if I do not admire them, I suffer more than my partner does. Um, at least I've seen that in my relationship, partially because if I have a time where I'm not fond of her and I'm not admiring her, I still have this ingrained like, well, be kind, and so I have this internal battle or whatnot where I'm like, I don't admire her, but like I should. And anyways, um, one of my favorite parts of this principle is that I can work on that fondness, work on that admiration, so that if I don't currently feel it, I can feel it in the future. I've also seen that. There have been times when I've been not fond of Grace, where I have not admired her, um, and there have been times when I have been fond and have admired her. And the difference between those times has had its base in my actions, my habits, and what I do. If I go and hug her more, if I go show her more physical affection, um, I become more fond, which is wild. But it's nice to know that, like, my actions make a difference in this sense. And my actions, if, helping me be more fond and admire Grace more, help me be happier. So anyways, that was a quick note on page 69. The other two places I underlined, I connected them. So I'll read the first one. It says on page 71, where it says having a fundamentally positive view of your spouse and your marriage is a powerful buffer when bad times hit. Absolutely true. Going on to the other ones that are connected, but developing a positive habit on page 72. But developing a positive habit doesn't sugarcoat a relationship. Instead, it resets it to a more realistic perspective. This can seem a little bit counterintuitive. When a lot of times when we think positively, it's like, oh, you're just, what is it, toxic positivity, fragile positivity, where you're just putting up a facade of what you think you should be thinking and not actually being, positive. It doesn't actually help. However, he claims here that developing a positive habit is more realistic than not, which I thought was interesting. And he clarifies it down below, still on page 72. So they did a study about positive, they were witnessing couples and doing positive, negative acts, etc. When the researchers compared the scores the couple gave themselves with those of the objective observers, they discovered that couples who described themselves as unhappily married only noticed half of the positive interactions that actually occurred. Because they were so used to tuning into their partner's mistakes, they each missed a full 50% of their partner's positive actions. So, of course, the inverse of this, when we do have a positive habit, we actually see the positive things more. Our eyes aren't clouded by our unhappiness in marriage, which I think is fascinating, that being positive gives you more realistic, more objective eyes instead of having rose-colored glasses, right? So it's makes me wonder if the analogy shouldn't be, oh, we have rose-colored glasses on, but instead we have gray-tinted glasses on, where we swap out our normal prescription with the gray glasses of negativity, where the negative observations are actually unrealistic and the positive ones are more realistic. So that was a cool paradigm shift a little bit. The rest of this chapter is a lot of activities. I didn't do any of these. I gave up after not doing the last chapters. Good question. So if I had more time, and Grace also had more time and was as introspective as I am, I would do this with her. But maybe sometime this next year. I have more time on my hands with my new job. So, but yeah, a lot of good activities. Mom, since you are becoming a licensed marriage and family therapist, I recommend looking at the activities, practicing them, and learning how to help others do them. So, but that is principle 2, nurture fondness and admiration. And let's go towards chapter 6, principle 3. Now, chapter 6, principle 3 is titled Turn Toward Each Other Instead of Away. I got a lot out of this chapter. So diving into it. Oh, actually, first, just the principle: turn towards each other instead of away. That has a lot of, for me, religious connotations, right? When we think of like repentance, repentance is turning toward Christ instead of away, and all that stuff. So I think this is a similar principle, just for our marriages, and so gospel principles can apply a lot of places, and this is one of them. The first lesson that I took was on a couple of pages, starting in page 88, where he says real life romance is fueled by far more humdrum scenes, and the context is, these Hollywood distortions of romance, but that real life romance is fueled by far more humdrum scenes. On the next page, at page 89, the first step in turning toward each other more is simply to be aware of how crucial these mini moments are, not only to your marriage's trust level, but to its ongoing sense of romance. For many couples, just realizing that they shouldn't take their everyday interactions for granted makes an enormous difference in their relationship. Remind yourself that being helpful to each other will do far more for the strength and passion of your marriage than a 2-week Bahamas getaway. Although I would like a 2-week Bahamas getaway. And this is all the concept of great marriages are built in mundanity, in the boring, everyday moments of life where you know your spouse is reaching for a cup and you're there, so you get them one. You get them the cup that they're looking for. Give them a quick back rub, a quick kiss on the peck on the cheek. And mid bottom of page 89, he says one virtue turning toward each other is that it is so easy to accomplish. In a variety of my other books, I've learned that things that are easy to do are just as easy not to do. And it's just as easy to turn towards your spouse as it is to turn to your phone. And it's so easy to overestimate or underestimate the power of the small actions every day turning toward your spouse, that it's so easy just not to do them because, they come up every day. You're like, if I miss this one, I can do one tomorrow. But when you miss one, it's easier to miss the next one and the next one and the next one. So build momentum in these small humdrum moments, and that momentum will carry you to a wonderful marriage. At least that's how I've seen it. That's how I've seen it. All right, next one. Oh, right, this was interesting. He identifies 2 obstacles in place that keep us from turning toward. The first of those obstacles, he says, is missing a bid, or sometimes, a bid being just a request for attention, kind of. He defines it better, but that works for now. Missing a bid because it's wrapped in anger or other negative emotion. The example he says here, Lena says, her husband Carl in exasperation. It would never occur to you to clear the table, would it? Carl doesn't hear Lena's bid, which is please clear the table tonight. Instead, he hears criticism, the first horseman. And this depiction that, in this example, Carl doesn't hear the bid, I think that is fascinating. On a psychological level, it's like, on a psychological level, we can't hear what somebody else is saying if we are so concerned about what we are going to say to them. One of Stephen Covey's habits is seek first to understand it, then to be understood. But if you're seeking to be understood, you don't have space to understand. And so we literally don't hear what the other person is saying when we are trying to figure out what we are going to say. Our brain doesn't work that way. Anyway, so when it's wrapped in anger or negative emotion, it's like our ears turn off. And that's a good thing to be aware of because emotion is rampant and ears are important. The next obstacle to turning towards somebody is being distracted by the wired world. And he says that the internet and digital devices pose a growing challenge to turning toward. I've noticed, I've seen that in my life. Of course, I don't think anybody hasn't, where devices are like the number one distraction from everything you want in life. Yeah, so not much to add there other than I agree, and it's hard. All right, next one. Page 103. I have underlined here, as soon as I get there, something about being there when you're upset. Right, give your partner the gift of being there when he or she is upset. And the lesson I took from this section is be okay with negative emotion, with sadness, with anger, with frustration. I think he talks about this a little bit later in the book as well, but those negative emotions are information. They aren't. If somebody is sad around you, that doesn't mean you failed. If your spouse is sad around you, that doesn't mean you failed. It's not a comment on your quality as a spouse if they have a bad day. Too often, I think, when somebody around us is upset, especially for conscientious people who can understand what other people are feeling and don't ignore it, we often fall into the trap of feeling like their feelings are our responsibility, which is good in the sense that like we try to help other people, but it's bad in the sense that we think their bad days are our fault, when that is not the case. A danger of thinking that way is that when somebody else is having a bad day, we think that they are making a comment on our quality as a human being. And then we can get defensive. And if somebody's having a bad day and we get defensive because they're having a bad day, that just makes the problem worse. So, main section from here, main lesson from here, is to be okay with somebody close to you having a bad day and just be there for them while they're having a bad day. Anyways, I like that part. The last section here, or the last lesson that I got from this is there's a section called What to Do When Your Spouse Doesn't Turn Toward You. And what I highlighted here is very often, page 108. Very often, couples turn away from each other not out of malice, but out of mindlessness. And I think this is just as dangerous. Mom, since this is for you, I'll add in a Book of Mormon reference. When, I think it's Nephi. Oh, geez, I made all that. Said Book of Mormon reference. Anyways, there's the concept of, like, the devil leads you with flaxen cords until it eventually become chains or something like that. I should have prepared more. This is a similar concept. Sometimes just mindlessness, just forgetting, is a flaxen cord, and every time we do it, we build the habit, we build the mindlessness in our relationship, and that eventually becomes a cord, a chain that drags us to marital unhappiness and dissatisfaction. So sometimes I think that just it goes back to the beginning of the chapter, right? Turning toward your partner is easy to do, and just as easy not to do. It is increasingly easy not to do in this day and age. And every time we don't do it, we add one more flaxen cord to our bonds. So, well, that was principle 3: turn toward each other instead of away. Yeah. Chapter 6. Now, chapter 7 was principle 4: let your partner influence you. Earlier in the book, I think it was earlier in the book, he talks about the concept of flooding, where your emotions flood, and it's kind of overwhelming emotions, and you don't quite know what to do. I was a little flooded in this chapter, and so I didn't quite underline as much because he mentioned several times that men have problems with this more than women. And so, of course, I was like, well, what are you talking about? I don't care about data. Data doesn't mean anything for the individual, right? Because, you can tell me the trends all you want, but anyways. So I didn't underline so much. So let me know what you thought of it, because I don't know if you'll be flooded the same way I was. Anyways, did get a few things. First of which, on page 118 and going into page 119, he mentions that all spiritual views of life are consistent with loving and esteeming your spouse. Oh, right, this is in reaction to some husbands who are like, oh, I have religious authority to dominate my family. He says, all spiritual views of life are consistent with loving and esteeming your spouse. And that's what accepting influence is all about. A little bit later, a marriage can't work unless both partners honor and respect each other. So, of course, loving and esteeming your spouse, I was like, well, yeah, that's, that applies to both men and women, so I'll underline that. And then a marriage can't work unless both partners honor and respect each other. I agree. It doesn't matter how much one partner loves and respects the other. If the other doesn't reciprocate, it's not a great marriage. So, I agree with this, and that all spiritual views of life are consistent with loving and esteeming your spouse. The next one, page 120, he says, accepting influence doesn't mean never expressing negative emotions toward your partner. I think this is a really important point. And also, he talks about it a little bit later in the book as well. But if you never express negative emotions toward your partner, they just build up. And you're not accepting influence. You are just suffering. And that's not fun. So, and the next was towards the end of the chapter because I was flooded. Um, 136, page 136. Yeah, that's right. The very last sentence. I was like, I should underline something. The ability to accept influence is a cornerstone of success, no matter which type of conflict you are facing. Now, I love how I said cornerstone of success. This principle, I think, relates to the love maps from a few chapters ago, where we all have our own little worlds, right? But when we accept the influence of our spouse, that means we are willing to change our world because of theirs in some way, right? We are accepting their influence in changing our world. And that means a lot because, well, it means a lot. If I change the way I see the world because of this other person that's accepting influence from them, and all of us hold so tightly to our versions of the world, any change it means a lot to it, it it takes a lot to change it, so it means a lot when it happens. But I've seen that when I am willing to modify my views, modify these parts of my world. Maybe maybe it's not the way that they want it exactly or whatnot, but any influence that I allow within my world um, is a testament to how much I care about my wife. So I can agree with that and support it. All right, now let's get into chapter 8. Now, chapter 8 is not about a principle. It is setting up for the next couple of principles. But chapter 8 is about the two kinds of marital conflict. See that on the YouTube thumbnail. Um, the two kinds are perpetual problems and solvable problems. What I think is interesting is that he says the majority of marital conflicts fall into the perpetual problems category. 69% of problems are not going to be solved. Um, which is like difficult and refreshing because it's like, well, I know we're not gonna fix this, so guess I'll learn to live with it. And that's what he talks about, in these perpetual problems on page 138. He says, despite their differences, these couples remain very satisfied with their marriages because they have hit upon a way to deal with their unmovable problems so that they don't become overwhelming. They've learned to keep them in their place and approach them with a sense of humor. I like that. Partially because I laugh a lot, and I like to laugh. It makes things a lot easier. My go-to is I'm really arrogant, and having a sense of humor about it uh, helps me come across as like charismatic instead of arrogant, even though I'm making fun of myself for thinking the way I think. As long as I can make a joke about it, it's all good. Anyways, then in the section about solvable problems, he says simply because a problem is solvable doesn't mean it gets resolved. I think this goes back to some of the earlier ideas concepts that I talked about, where simple doesn't mean easy, right? In fact, sometimes when we know a problem is solvable and it doesn't get resolved, that's more difficult because it was a choice. It was a choice. And so it feels worse than a perpetual problem that doesn't get resolved. All right, then on page 157, yeah, while I'm turning there, one of the perpetual problems that we have is just Grace and I have different levels of the amount of mess we can handle, and that is a perpetual problem. It's not going away, and I have learned to deal with it and work not from home. So, all right, that's all I'll say. Page 157. Negative emotions hold important information about how to love each other better. I think this is vital here because kind of harking back to one of the earlier chapters that I talked about, where negative emotions are important not to ignore. They bottle up and they provide information about how to love each other better. A negative emotion that I feel a lot is loneliness. I feel like I'm alone. That's one of my biggest fears and whatnot. Is just like being alone. Um, and so that negative emotion holds a lot of information for Grace about what she can do to help me feel welcome, right? And help me feel safe. So, and on the flip side, Grace has a similar sentiment where she frequently worries about me leaving her, and I am not going to in the foreseeable future. But it holds important information for me about how to help her feel safe, help her feel secure. So I think that's vital. Negative emotions provide important information about what is important to our spouse. So don't shy away from negative information. The next thing I underlined was on the same page, where he says there is no absolute reality in marital conflict, only two subjective ones. This connects back to the kind of the different worlds that we live in, the love maps and whatnot, and that neither of our worlds are accurate. They aren't absolute reality. They're a subjective reality. And if we treat our world as absolute reality, that poses a problem for the other person who also sees their world as absolute reality, and they clash and they break. So, remember that what you see is what you see, it's not what is. So, the last item on here has to do with couples that focus on fondness and admiration. He says, whatever issue they are discussing, they give each other the message that they are loved and accepted, warts and all. I think this is a nice way to wrap up the chapter where he talks about how negative emotions are important. None of us are perfect, but the couples that get through the perpetual problems, the solvable problems, treat each other that they are loved and accepted, even with those perpetual problems, even with those solvable problems. The problem never becomes more important than the person. So I think that's a good way to end this chapter on the two kinds of marital conflict. Chapter 9 covers Principle 5. We learned about perpetual and solvable problems in the last chapter. Principle 5 is to solve your solvable problems. Who would have thought? And it goes through, soften the startup, learn to make and receive repair attempts, suit yourself and each other, compromise, and process any grievances, etc. So I'll go through a few things that stood out to me. First of which, on page 161, is that these are skills that we have, right? He says we just get out of the habit of using them in our most intimate relationship. To a certain degree, my fifth principle comes down to having good manners. I think it's interesting that we do get out of the habit of using them in our closest relationship. Mostly because we're in that relationship all the time, and so the gloves come off, we get comfortable, and we forget to treat our partner like a person. So don't forget, or else you'll bind yourself with flaxen cords and do yourself carefully down to hell. All right, the second thing I highlighted was on page 164, where he says more often marriages end because, to avoid constant skirmishes, husband and wife distance themselves so much that their friendship and sense of connection are lost. Now, I think this is an interesting point here. He introduces the concept of bring up your problems, or else you will lose the sense of connection, which I think is fascinating. There is I think that there's a number of studies. Either way, I don't know. I don't have the studies off the top of my head, but I have experience that said that where I know that the harder an event that you go through with people, the closer you feel to those people. In some cases, sure, trauma bonding. But when I was working with Deloitte, we had a number of very difficult seasons. And because I got through those seasons with some of my coworkers, I consider them to be a lot closer as friends. I just feel a lot closer to them because we did something difficult together. So in the same way, if you avoid some of the constant skirmishes or whatnot, you avoid the potential for a close relationship. Now, that's not to say don't make up things just so you can have a stronger relationship. You don't need to. Things will come up. All right. Later in that page, he says, taking some responsibility for the problem is a very important part of a softened startup. This is more about a tactic. And I've seen this a lot, where if I say, okay, so I know that I didn't do this, etc. I know I'm not the perfect person that I know you think I am. Um, when I take some responsibility, that helps everybody else feel better. So do it. Don't be afraid of it. All right. Next on page 167. Oh, right. This is interesting. So this is again talking about tactics when you bring up problems. He says, remember, if you go straight for the jugular, you're going to draw plenty of blood. And to me, it's just a reminder that whenever we have these zingers, I have so many zingers. I have spent hours in the shower. Well, not at one time, not for a long time. Thinking of zingers of what I would say to help somebody realize, like, oh, I see the error of my ways. Thank you for crafting that comment in such a way that it bypassed all of my mental protections, and now I am a changed person. That's not going to happen. If you go for the jugular, you're going to get blood. And it will go for your jugular too. He says later, however justified you may feel in blaming your spouse, the bottom line is that this approach is not productive. You're just going to get a lot of blood, a lot of retaliation. So don't. So don't. On the next page, page 168, at the bottom, he says, don't wait too long before bringing up an issue. And I think I've talked about this a number of times within this book. The more you wait to bring up something, the more it rots. Now, there are some exceptions. If you can actually forget about it, then the rest has gone away. But if you keep thinking about it, don't wait too long before you bring it up. So. Next is page 175. This was a long chapter. I had a lot to say on it. Page 175. What did I? Oh, right. Oh, yes. Yes. So he talks about repair attempts, which is essentially when you're in an argument, it's an attempt to find common ground, to come closer together, to repair the relationship that you have damaged. And he says many, if not, oh yeah, right. He gives phrases to use as repair attempts. He says many, if not all, of these phrases will probably sound phony and unnatural to you. That's because they offer a very different way of speaking with your spouse when you're upset. But their phoniness is not a reason to reject them. If you learned a better and more effective way to hold your tennis racket, it would feel wrong and unnatural initially, simply because you weren't used to it yet. The same goes for these repair attempts. Over time, they'll come easily to you, and you'll modify them to more closely suit your style of speech and personality. That's something that I think is vital to remember here, is that this is a relationship book, and the reason that it works is because it has things that you're not currently doing, that I'm not currently doing, and to improve, we need to do something different than we're used to. That will always feel a little weird, but with practice, it will become second nature, and we will change to be somebody who is kinder to our spouses. So I've seen that. I'm not going to give too many details because I am arrogant after all. But the next one is on page 184, all about compromise. He says that compromise, like it or not, compromise is the only way to solve marital problems. Woohoo! For me, this is hitting the point home where I know I've talked about it, like our separate worlds a lot. If you hold that your world is the absolute truth and you are going to die on that hill, your marriage will die on that hill as well. But understanding that your world is not the absolute truth, the way you see things is not objectively true. It can have valuable information, but is not the truth. Is the only way to compromise. Because if you feel like the way you see things is the way things are, then any compromise feels like a betrayal of reality, right? You're like, I can't believe that you're making me forsake my belief that the sky is blue or something like that, or whatever it is. Like the content of the belief doesn't matter as much. But that if you see your perspective as fully objective and an accurate picture of reality, you will not be able to compromise. Because I've belated this point a little bit much. On the next page, it says it takes a lot of time and self-awareness and pain. He doesn't say pain, but I say pain because it does take pain. All right, page 194. Last one for this chapter. Oh, yeah, this is an interesting point. It says, when you have mastered the general problem-solving skills outlined in this chapter, you'll discover that many of your problems find their own solutions. Once you get past the barriers that have prevented clear communication, difficulties are much easier to resolve. That is so true. In my disagreements with my wife, uh, when we get to the point where she feels seen and heard and loved and cared for, and I feel not alone, and I feel loved and cared for and secure. It's almost like we don't have a problem anymore, because to me, all problems are one of are some need that's not being met. We're not feeling loved, and that's the problem itself is more of a manifestation of that not feeling loved than it is an actual problem. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes there are those problems. But when there are those problems and you don't feel loved, they become a lot bigger. If there are those problems and you do feel loved, it's just like logistics, right? You're just chatting about the weather, essentially, with no worry about what it means for your relationship, what it means for your sense of security. So I definitely agree that many problems find their own solutions, because usually the solution is you just need to help them feel loved. So that's my take on chapter 9. Uh, Solve your solvable problems. Now, in the past couple chapters, we've been talking about solvable problems, unsolvable problems, etc. Chapter 10 is not a principle, but it has tips for coping with typical solvable problems. Now, the first one, and this, of course, chapter gives you strategies for coping with typical solvable problems. The first typical solvable problem that it talks about is unplugging from distractions. Now, and the task here, of course, is maintaining connection and intimacy amid the distractions of the internet age. This is on page 196. Now, this is interesting. This book was published, I believe it was 2015, and quite a few things have happened since that time, right? 2015, I mean, wow, that was the year I left on my mission. That was wild. Yeah, 2015, the most recent edition, 2015. And so, social media was in its full swing. There were well, everybody my age had social media, right? But since then, um, the algorithms have gotten better, the content has gotten more interesting, and there's now AI, which helps a lot of people to identify the most vulnerable parts of the human brain in terms of like attention seeking and whatnot, and targets those with really interesting things. So this section, unplugging from distractions and focusing on your relationship, is only going to be more and more vital for a healthy marriage as we go forward. Um, and you might think that you're safe with not interacting with a whole lot of social media and whatnot, but AI is also targeting with like politics and news articles, right? So um it's not quite as simple as that. So anyways, the next one that I wanted to bring up that I found was interesting in the stress and more stress section. The solution on page 201 he mentions is that you need to acknowledge that at the end of a long, stressful day, you may need time to yourself to decompress before interacting with each other. The part that's difficult for me here is acknowledging that I do need time. I tend to think that I'm superhuman and I can just do it all, or at least that I should be able to do it all, should be superhuman. Now, don't get me wrong, believing that has helped give me a goal to strive for, and I think that believing that has helped me become more competent. However, um, I am not the superhuman, right? And I do need time to decompress after a long, stressful day. And acknowledging that is super it's vital, right? Because if I don't acknowledge it, I believe I can do more for my wife than I actually can do. Um, then I try to promise to do that, and then I don't, and things happen. In fact, just recently, on Sundays, but usually I have every other week I have a meeting before a couple hours before church. So on those weeks I need to go in early. I need to wake up early. Um, Along with like pretty much every other day, I wake up pretty early and start getting working as soon as I pretty much can. But every other Sunday, I don't have a meeting in the morning. And since our church is at 9, that lets me sleep in until like 7. And then I like having a slow morning. I have not communicated that to my wife. I had not communicated that to my wife. And so there was a week where I woke up, I got my daughter up, or no, she got me up, but I didn't get her ready for church before I had to get ready for church. And my wife was mad at me because she was like, "Well, you had time, you didn't do it." But she said that if you need that time, that's okay. Just let me know, and I'll have that as my expectation. And so at that point, I had the option to say, "Oh no, of course I can do it. I can be superhuman. I can do all these things." Um, but I realized that I did like that time, and that's okay. I can like that time, and yeah, take it for myself. I think that's helped. So that's that section. Next one is on the same page. The relations with the in-laws, and the task here is to establish a sense of we-ness or solidarity. And he mentions that the real family tension is more frequently between the wife and her mother-in-law. Reading this whole section, I was just filled with gratitude that my wife and my wife's mother-in-law get along. They enjoy each other's company. I feel like I haven't really had to pick between the two all that frequently, and when I have, um, it hasn't been that emotional or that heart wrenching. I think probably the most heart wrenching thing for you, mother, is that we live far away, and that's not me just choosing. So it's not. I've never really felt split between my wife and my mother-in-law. And possibly it's because I've already committed to my wife, so to speak. I just want to thank you for encouraging me to side with my wife. So, uh, yeah, I after reading some of the experiences and some of the stories and whatnot, I was just glad that I don't deal with that as much. So I appreciate you having a good relationship with my wife. The next section, on page 207, it talks about money, money, money. The task is balancing the freedom and empowerment money represents with the security and trust it also symbolizes. Um, I'm really big into personal finances and personal money management. So of course, I love this section, and I feel like my wife and I have a good system. I've talked about it a couple of times, so I won't go into details. But I agree that balancing freedom and empowerment with the security and trust is difficult. That's something that my wife and I have conflicted on. Is that to me, money represents security and trust, and the more money we have in the bank, the more secure we are. That's not the case for my wife, and so we've had to find a way to balance that. I think it's been pretty good. So, all right, next on page 218 is all about when you do have a kid, things change. Who'd have thought? He mentions here that 67% of wives experience a precipitous plummet in their marital satisfaction. Then he says it's the big mystery isn't why 67% feel so miserable, but why the other 33% don't. And he says that it has everything to do with whether the husband experiences the transformation to parenthood along with his wife or gets left behind. I think I've been in a number of ways pretty fortunate here, is that we tried having a kid about 4 years before we actually did, right? And as part of that miscarriage, I was already kind of transitioning mentally to be ready to be a father. And so I had 4 years of being like, I want to be a father, and just kind of waiting for it to happen. And then I didn't feel like it was a huge transformation for me. Of course, some of the tactics were different. Of course, like some of the behaviors, um, caring for a kid takes a little bit more energy. It takes less sleep, etc. Um, but overall, I think I was more ready to make that transformation because of the time that I had wanted that life. So I hope Grace did not feel that plummet in marital satisfaction. So, but I don't know. I need to check. I need to check with her actually. I think we've been. I don't think it was the child as much as my work, to be honest. So, um, yeah, that was this section, coping with typical solvable problems. There was a lot more examples in here, so let me know what your experiences have been with some of these. Um, but yeah, next is chapter 11, which I think we are back to another principle. We've talked about solvable problems for the past couple chapters. I think this next one, yep, principle 6, chapter 11, overcoming gridlock. So let's get into it. Chapter 11, principle 6, overcome gridlock. So we've talked about solvable problems for the past few chapters. This one is about the unsolvable problems where you're in gridlock. The first section, the first part that I liked that stood out to me, page 237, second page of the chapter, he says, the more adept you become at following the other 6 principles, the less likely you are to gridlock over intractable differences. I liked this because everything is like a cross-pollinating flower in a sense. If you improve one aspect of your relationship, the rest of these principles kind of fall into line, right? And so with gridlock, it's easier not to need to overcome gridlock if the rest of the principles are in line. Of course, in this chapter, he talks about how to go through that and how to actually overcome it when you do find yourself in gridlock. Um, but I liked how he says here that there is a way where you don't need to be in gridlock as often, and that is the rest of the principles. And to me, that um, it's a principle that it's a principle, but the concept of other aspects of your improving certain aspects of your life also improve other even unrelated aspects of your life. I find that when I am more secure in my finances, right? If when I know what's coming in, what's going out, it's not on my mind, and then I'm better at work. I'm better in my relationship. I'm better at being a dad. Um, when I'm healthier, when I consistently work out, of course my body's stronger, rar. Um, but I'm also more mentally aware, which helps me in my relationships. Oh, and then not just mentally aware, but emotionally stable. I'm a lot more emotionally stable when I'm consistently working out, which of course spills into my relationships, my work. Um, so this concept of improving one aspect of your life improves a lot of others as well. I have found to be true in a lot of different areas of my life. So I'm glad he called it out here that when you are adept at following the other 6 principles, this one isn't needed as much. So that was my first thought. The next thought I had a couple pages later on page 239 talks about. Oh, right. Okay. So connecting my first my first underlining point wasn't really about gridlock. When he goes into gridlock, he clarifies that gridlock is essentially two dreams conflicting. Each individual in the marriage has their own kind of dream and what they expect. Gridlock is when they don't mix. On page 239, he gives the example of um, if a couple thinks, one person in the couple wants to go to dinner every Sunday night, the other wants to have a home cooked meal. He says to one, Sunday night is a let's see, yeah, her dream is to eat out because her family did that every Sunday, and it was a treat that made her feel special. But for him, a restaurant meal was always much less of a treat than a home cooked meal when she was busy because it symbolized her love for him, right? And he closes this out with the question of whether of a restaurant versus a home meal is really symbolic of what makes each of them feel loved. And I like diving into this concept here where the actual tactics or the actual details of what you're discussing are just symbolic of dreams further upstream, right? It's not that you need to have the details exactly right because those details matter so much. The reason those details matter is because of what they mean to you. And it's not the details themselves, it's the meaning behind the details. So if you can understand the meaning behind the details, you can figure out a way to make it work for both. And even when you understand the meaning behind the details, um, you feel more love, really. You understand each other better, and it's easier to come to a solution. So yep. All that to say, I agree that it's the question of the details is really just symbolic of how each of you are feeling. And if you can address the feelings, that goes a long way towards actually overcoming the problems that you're having. All right. The last one. This was a good chapter. I liked it. Not that many things that I underlined though. But the last section that I underlined, is in the Become a Dream Detective on page 244. And I'm just going to read the last paragraph. He says, often, deeply personal dreams go unspoken or underground because we assume they must in order to make the relationship work. It's common for both partners not to feel entitled to their dreams. They may see their own desires as childish or impractical, but such labels don't end the longing. So if the relationship doesn't honor the dream, conflict will almost inevitably ensue. In other words, when you bury a dream, it just resurfaces in disguised form as a gridlocked conflict. I felt this a few times where what I think should happen or what I want to happen, I just bury because that's selfish of me. It's selfish of me to have a dream. It's selfish of me to want something, right? However, I have definitely felt that it just resurfaces it as something else, right? It doesn't go away. And so you need to understand what your dreams are so then you can communicate them to your spouse, who then has the opportunity to love you more fully than they would otherwise. So I think this concept of being aware of my own dreams, of being aware of what I want in a relationship and what makes me feel loved and all the good things about marriage, being aware of those and not being ashamed of them has been a big step for me. I'm not, still taking the step, but it's been a big realization for me to be okay with wanting things, be okay with having a dream, um, and not viewing myself as selfish because of because of wanting something. So those were my overarching thoughts about overcoming gridlock. He gives a lot of good examples. I didn't go through a lot of the activities that he has, of course, because it's less than a week till Christmas, but don't tell anybody that. And yeah, I like this because there are. I want to go back to the statistic that he shared, where about 69% of marital problems will not be resolved. You just need to find a way to live with it, and that can be amazing. Like finding a way to accept it and live with it. Um, if ultimately, in my experience, that leads to a better future than one where it is solved, which is wild. Because yeah, wild. So, anyways, that was Principle 6, Overcoming Gridlock. Chapter 12 and Principle 7 is all about creating shared meaning. Now, all of the other principles have mainly focused on getting to a good point in your marriage, right? If you don't have fondness or you don't admire your spouse, you should probably do that. Overcoming problems, like we talked about in the past couple of chapters. And this last one is like once you've gotten to a good place, right? How do you go further and have a wonderful marriage, right? This is the what's next principle. Create shared meaning. Reading this chapter was interesting. He sets, there's 4 pillars of shared meaning, right? Rituals of connection, support for each other's roles, having shared goals, and shared values and symbols. All in all, it's a pretty short chapter because, I mean, if you're in a good spot, it's kind of like go for it, keep it up, do good things. Uh, yeah, yeah. There were a few things that I liked from this one though. On page 262, he italicized it and I underlined it. He says a crucial goal of any marriage, therefore, is to create an atmosphere that encourages each person to talk honestly about his or her convictions. I like this one. I probably touched on it a couple times before, but if you don't feel comfortable talking about your convictions in your marriage, you'll never know what the other person is convicted for, what they want, want to strive for. And as a result, you won't know how to best help them. They won't know how to best help you, and you'll just kind of be living parallel lives. And so that is why it's important. It is important to foster an atmosphere that encourages each person to talk about what they want. And yeah, this is a step beyond knowing what you want and being okay with having wants. This is making sure that your spouse feels comfortable talking about what they want, right? And not shaming them for having something that they do want. Yeah, I like this. I think it is I agree. It is a crucial goal. Because it comes before all the other ones. It is a key goal for sure. All right. The next one. Yeah. On page 264. Yeah, this is in the pillar of rituals of connection. He says the hallmark of rituals of connection is that they are not haphazard. They are structured, scripted traditions that you can depend on. You know how events will play out, and that you will have each other's attention and connect in a manner you both find meaningful. I'm not great at this. I'm great at like, oh, this would be so much fun to have structure. But then when, it gets late, we're tired, we both had long days, I'm like, sometimes I just forget about it. And we don't have that connection, that ritual to connect. So I think I do like this. I think it's important. I don't have many examples to say, oh, we've done this really well yet. I will eventually at one point, maybe. Yeah. So I agree that the pillar 2 is interesting, support for each other's roles. He clarifies here that what roles means depends on your relationship, right? So what do they expect from you? What do you expect from them? It's not this has to be this way or that way or whatnot. So, and then shared goals. I love goals. That's another topic. I love striving for something that you don't currently have. So, shared values and symbols. That's cool. I think, yeah, I think in the whole creating shared meaning section, I have a room to grow. I don't have a whole lot of personal examples of, oh, we did this and it was fantastic. So I think this chapter in particular was more about giving me ideas of what we could do in the future and less about, oh, I've seen this in my life. So let me know after reading this chapter, what are some of the rituals and the other pillars and whatnot have you found has helped you come closer to your husband. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And that's the book. This last section is the afterword. What now? There's still a few things that I like from this, but those are the 7 principles. Now, in the what now section, I did like. Oh yeah, this was interesting. So, page 280 says the marital poop detector. Starts off by saying that some marriage experts claim that a significant cause of unhappiness in marriage is that husbands and wives have overblown expectations of each other, the rationale being that you can lower your expectations and be happier. However, him and other professors and stuff have found that people with the greatest inflection is important, has found that people with the greatest expectations for their marriage usually wind up with the highest quality marriages. This suggests that by holding your relationship to high standards, you are far more likely to achieve the kind of marriage you want than you are by looking the other way and letting things slide. I read that and I had to stop. Because in certain parts of my relationship, I have lowered my standards and we have all been happier as a result. For example, I hold myself to a high standard of exercise, of physical fitness. And for a time, I set that expectation for my wife as well. That was a problem. Similarly, I hold myself to a high standard for how I spend my time, how productive I am. For a period of time, I applied that standard to my wife. That wasn't great either. And so over time, I've lowered those expectations, and my quality of marriage has improved. And so this passage made me pause and rethink a bit. and rethink, like, do I need to get on my wife for, doing these things? Do I need to expect her to live the way I would expect? I probably should have continued reading, because when I do, he says the couples we studied who adjusted to elevated levels of negativity, irritability, emotional distance in their marriage ended up less happy or satisfied years later. Those who refused to put up with lots of negativity, who insisted on gently confronting each other when, say, contempt or defensiveness threatened to become pervasive, wound up happy and satisfied years later. So he clarifies in the second paragraph that expectations of levels of negativity in the marriage, specifically, irritability, emotional distance, contempt, defensiveness, all those things. Essentially, the expectations for how your spouse will treat you, not for how they will live their life. And that clarity helped me a lot, because the focus there is not on expectation. It's not just across the board expectations. It's expectations on levels of negativity. And those, I think I've maintained a pretty high level of expectations for that. Like, I respect my wife. I expect her to respect me as well. And when there is contempt or defensiveness, to be open about it and not to hide it, to bring it up quickly and frequently, because it happens frequently. And doing that has helped us a lot. So after a detour, I do agree. Have high expectations, specifically for the levels of negativity. Yeah, with the caveat that not everything is considered negativity. Okay, then this is the last underline, my last underline for the whole book, on page 283. This is in a section about forgiving yourself as well. But he says, if you consider yourself inadequate, you are always on the lookout for what is not there in yourself and your partner. I've experienced this so much, not just in my marriage relationship, but I've found that when I am lacking in a certain area, I tend to identify how everybody else is also lacking in that area far more than I am. If there's been a week where I haven't worked out a whole lot, right, or I haven't eaten well, I'm like, man, well, I'm so much better than other people at working out. The average American is fat and obese, and I'm not, so I'm awesome. But I have those judgmental thoughts more frequently when I myself am insecure about something. If I've had a really bad productivity week or day, the thoughts creep in of like, well, I'm awesome. I am so productive. I can do so many things. And that happens in my marriage too. And it's hard to notice that and see it as insecurity instead of get mad at other people instead. That's the insidious nature of this concept. Is that when you start thinking that way, you don't realize that you are. At least my experience is, I just start judging people. I just start judging my wife and saying, well, you all suck, because, and I don't realize that it's because I'm insecure until like a couple of days later. And so being able to notice that quickly is so key. Anyways, well, that was the afterword, and that was the final underline I made in the book. I liked a lot of it. I didn't underline everything. A lot of really good stuff. I'm excited to know what your thoughts are. You don't have to take it chapter by chapter. Just whenever you find something that's interesting, I'm happy to hear about it. And I hope that this asynchronous intellectual conversation has been as fun for you as it has been for me. So, Merry Christmas.